Well, hello again, Steve here. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about rights versus justice. And I think this is important on our inner genie path because if we're looking at in slightly the wrong direction, or if there could be a better direction for us to look in terms of our getting our mindset straight, getting our what we stand for straight, if we can get to the point of making more logic in ourselves, we have the less tendency to have sort of cognitive dissonance within our mind, which can be very distracting and very discouraging and very, because a lot of times we can invest in something and then it never really works that way, never really makes sense to us, and it can cause this internal strife within ourselves, I think. And I'm going to use Nelson Mandela as an example for this, and I don't have anything that I can point to right now that I can conclusively say that all of what Nelson Mandela was ill-intended. I think perhaps a lot of what he did was well-intended. I'm sure that that was the case. I mean, most people sincerely believe that a good bit of the time what they're after is well-intended. But if we look at the consequences of people's actions, it can tell us a lot about whether or not the direction was correct. And I think Nelson Mandela's direction is a good example of that. And the reason this topic came to mind for me was somebody I know recently texted me and said, "Hey, have you ever watched a movie about Nelson Mandela called The Long Walk to Freedom," or something like that. I had heard about it. I don't even know if that's the correct title, but it's something along that line. I had heard about it, but never had watched it. And honestly, I don't know a whole lot about the story of Nelson Mandela. But what I'm quite familiar with, and somewhat, not quite, but somewhat familiar with, is the disaster known as modern South Africa, which is quite involved with Nelson Mandela. That's one thing I am quite certain of. Nelson Mandela had a large part to do with what's going on in South Africa now, which, from what I can see, is an absolute disaster. So, and where this comes in terms of rights, and we see this a lot now with the rabid left that's going crazy with occupying certain parts of countries and burning things down and claiming to care about people but not caring about them, like that black ex-police officer who was gunned down in one of the riots. Apparently Black Lives Matter, but that his didn't matter because he was on the wrong side of the spectrum, and so on and so on. I mean, there's all this dissonance that goes on, right? And what I notice in the conversations and what's being said by people who are running crazy and wanting to create change is they're talking about rights. A lot of times they're talking about rights. They want the right to do this and the right to that, and they want reparations, and they feel victimized and all of this sort of thing, rather than talking about justice. Or if they talk about justice, they usually put some sort of an adjective in front of it. Like they want social justice, or they want eco-justice, or they want this group's lives matters and that group lives matters, or this, etc., etc. It's all sort of italicized, right? It's like, it's not just justice, because justice, if the saying was we want justice, well, that would be justice for all, right? Because we wouldn't be able to put an adjective on it. And the same kind of goes for rights a lot of times. It's like the reason people are yelling for rights is because they deem that somebody has the right to do that and somebody doesn't. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of this is kind of phony, because if you look at where that word is coming from, that word right, what that word right means is basically correct. So we already know we have the right to do whatever we can do. Everybody has the right to do whatever they can do. Whether they get away with it or whether there's repercussions for it is another story. But they have the right to do it because it's correct. right? Is it correct that you can throw a rock through somebody's window? Yeah, that's correct. That's your right to do that. That is a right. That's correct. You can pick up a stone. If you're able to pick up a stone, you can pick up a stone. If you're able to throw a stone, you can throw a stone. If that stone is big enough and it hits a certain window, it's going to go through the window. That's correct. You have the right to do that. Now, there's ramifications for that if you're not a rabid leftist being supported by etc., right? But there generally are ramifications for that. The broken window, you could get thrown back at, etc., right? But that's not justice as anybody would define it. Because justice, if you look at it, this means what is the balance between what I can do and what the ramifications are. And justice would say that if I want to live a peaceful life, then I'm going to extend that to the next man or the next woman beside me wants to live a peaceful life. And therefore, I'm not going to do anything that would transgress and affect that person's peaceful life. That would be along the lines of justice. A right would be, I have the right to do this or do that, and that's correct. But what it normally means in common society is you have a right which is protected by certain people's guns. And this is what I think this guy Nelson Mandela wanted. Nelson Mandela saw that his group of people, the blacks, were not able to do what another group of people could do within the legal framework. And they wanted that to change. They wanted that they had the right to do things, but they would be heavier. They'd be stopped eventually by somebody, and they wanted that to go away. But they wanted to get a hold of the power of the state, which is what they saw the white people as having, in order to do that. What we see in the long run is that they got these rights, and what they did then is they completely reversed it. So now they are subjugating the whites to a much greater extent than they were ever subjugated. And whites are fleeing South Africa as fast as they can. Meanwhile, when the whites ran it, blacks were struggling as hard as they could to get into South Africa. As bad as the international media would say that it was, blacks were struggling, and birth rates and the population of blacks was skyrocketing in South Africa during this so-called terrible white rule. Meanwhile, under black rule, whites are running for their lives. So this is the legacy of Nelson Mandela, because I think he was after rights for the blacks, which was rights for the blacks. And in fact, I saw him in an interview there where he was talking about the Palestinians, and he was talking about Yasser Arafat, and he was talking about Muammar Gaddafi and Fidel Castro. Those were all of his buddies, which are known to be pretty awful people, right? Because Nelson Mandela was a communist after all. So he was after sort of rights for his people, for his cause, rather than justice. And justice, if he was after justice without some sort of a caveat on what kind of justice, if it was just justice that he was after, he would have been after equality under the law, which would have meant you wouldn't have what you have now, which is that if you're black, you get one right, and if you're white, you get no rights, basically, in the law. Which was what he was trying to eliminate for the blacks. He was trying to eliminate, at least on the surface of it. That's what he said he was after. He was after blacks being able to do what white people could do. But he didn't say that once he got that power, that he would take away the whites' legal right to do what the blacks now can do. I think this is the problem. This is the problem when people go for rights as opposed to justice. A right is like this grant that we have upon ourselves by, in a general sense, that is. It's a right that is sort of, it's a sort of like a privilege granted by an organization that we humans have built, right? Whereas justice is philosophical in a way. We stand back and we look at what makes sense, and we ask ourselves, look, if it's not okay for me to take what is unearned, then it's also not okay for somebody else to take what is not unearned, what is unearned. And we universalize. So justice in its justice in its sort of philosophical origin is universal. So we universalize stuff, and we can have true peace, and it's logical. Whereas rights in a philosophical sense means just correct. Yeah, you can do that, but it's not morally possible. It's not universally possible. It's not morally possible for everybody to be committing crimes at once. It just doesn't work that way in long term, right? So rights are unsustainable, whereas justice is sustainable. And of course, as soon as you bring rights into the political realm, into the legal system, if you will, then there's no end to this jigging that will go on. There's no end to it, and that's why books get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and they just never end. And there's this whole industry of lawfare that'll then go on, especially when you bring groups into it and identities into it and so on and all this sort of thing. There's, blacks need to be recognized for this, and whites need to be recognized for this, and aboriginals this, and women this, and so on. That is no longer justice, because justice removes all of these identity triggers and looks at each individual as that. It's color blind, it's sex blind, it's race blind, it's culture blind, it's religion blind, it's all of that blind, and it just says, what is justice? Whereas rights, that's a unholy game, and there's no end to that. So I think we got to think of that. I think it's hopefully helpful in terms of helping us to see things more universally, more systematically, more philosophically. Helps us in the thinking process. Steve here again, great chatting. If you like what I'm doing, please like, subscribe, and share. We'll talk again soon. Bye for now.